Chapter 10, When Karma Meets Fate Meets Destiny. At this point, Danny tried genuinely to establish something real with League. Not as a king, not as the off-grid Norseman, not even as the dragon holding a territory together by force of will, just as a man who had burned through chapters faster than most people read them, and who still believed stubbornly that something stable could be built if he kept moving forward instead of digging in. So they traveled. Scotland, Wales, long stretches of England, roads folding into one another. Miles marked not by destinations but by conversations, silences, and the rhythm of tires on tarmac. This wasn't escape. It was pilgrimage. They met Waywoodians along the way. Not subjects, not followers, but people who had felt the pull of the same gravity from afar. Shared meals, shared stories, shared laughter that only makes sense when you've all survived something similar. The kingdom wasn't on the land anymore. It was distributed, carried in people, in memory, in recognition. For a dragon, movement does something essential. Stasis builds pressure, motion releases it. Each new landscape reset the internal weather just enough. Mountains widened perspective, coastlines softened edges. Forests reminded him that sovereignty doesn't need walls to exist. The wandering dragon isn't weaker than the crowned one. Sometimes it's the only form that can survive the aftermath of rule. With Lee, there were moments that felt almost right, almost peaceful. Snake energy adapting to terrain, reading emotional shifts, sensing when to move and when to wait. On the surface, it looked like healing, like reconnection. But underneath, the same Zodiac truth remained. Dragons roamed to integrate. Snakes roamed to test. Danny was gathering meaning. Lee was measuring distance. Still, the road mattered, because each place they visited stripped another layer of illusion away. Each meeting reminded Danny that Waywood had never been about geography. It had been about recognition, people seeing the same pattern, the same refusal to shrink, the same insistence on standing where others would kneel. By the time they looked back again, Danny wasn't the same dragon who had left. He was lighter, less armored, more aware of the cost of carrying unfinished cycles. This was the wandering dragon phase. Not lost, not settled, but learning finally that movement itself could be a teacher. And teachers, unlike kingdoms, don't need to be defended. The movement changed everything. Once they started traveling, really traveling, not escaping, but moving with intent, the idea of route stopped meaning stillness. Roads became connective tissue. Each mile pulled the past apart and stitched something quieter, stronger into place. It was movement that led to the van. Not as a symbol, not as rebellion, just necessity. A way to stay in touch with Waywoodians. A way to keep the threads alive without being nailed to one patch of ground. And for the first time, something rare happened. The royal family bonded. Not in ceremony, not in posture, but in proximity. The king, the queen, the little prince, shared meals, shared nights, shared laughter, shared exhaustion. A small orbit of loyal faces drifting in and out. Fireside conversations, laybys, borrowed fields. Familiar smiles reappearing miles from where they were last seen. This wasn't a kingdom in formation. This was a family in motion. Ellen was back, stronger than before, clearer, almost as if her absence had been required. Removed not by rejection, but by timing. Snakes don't vanish without reason. They move when the ground shifts. Ellen stepping out created the space for Kat to step in. Kat stepping in created the path for Danny to meet Tommy. And only then, only when the circuit was complete, did Ellen return. Uncomfortable to watch if you don't understand it, necessary if you do, like a scab forming over a wound, ugly on the surface, healing underneath. The dragon doesn't always see the pattern while he's inside it. And then there was Annie. Not loud, not dramatic, not even romantic. She was just there, sheepdog energy at its most honest, grief carried quietly, service without ledger. She didn't want a crown. Didn't want proximity to power. She showed Danny something he hadn't learned yet. How to stand without being needed. How to give without expecting return. How to exist without role or title. For a dragon, that's destabilizing in the best possible way. Faith rekindled not through belief, but through behavior. This wasn't the end of chaos, but it was the end of pretending stability only lives in one place. The wandering dragon was learning that motion could be a home. As the wandering continued, something inside Danny finally clicked into place. Not loudly, not with thunder or prophecy, quietly, reliably. like a compass needle settling once the interference clears. For the first time, he wasn't just moving, he was inhabiting the traveler. The nomad wasn't a phase anymore. It wasn't reactionary. It wasn't running from rubble. It was an instinct finally being allowed to breathe. Roads stopped feeling like escape routes and started feeling like arteries. Each place passed through fed something ancient in him. A dragon doesn't always want a throne. Sometimes it wants horizon. And that's where Annie mattered more than she probably ever realized. She didn't give answers. She didn't crown him with belief. She cut through the mist on Omnist Hill by refusing to play any role other than herself. Sheepdog clarity, grounded grief, service without spectacle. She validated him not by agreeing, but by standing steady while he worked it out himself. That kind of presence is rare. It doesn't pull, it doesn't push. It simply is and forces truth to surface. The fog began to thin. What Danny started to realize was this. The magic wasn't up in the sky anymore. It wasn't God shouting from hilltops or chaos demanding response. The magic was being built in the walls now, at ground level. Brick by brick, choice by choice, behavior by behavior. Faith wasn't something you proclaimed. It was something you practiced. The ground level mind fortress was no longer just containment. It was cultivation. And around this time, Danny started to see it. Not the whole picture. Dragons rarely get that luxury, but enough to know he wasn't lost. The wandering wasn't aimless. The connections weren't random. The losses weren't punishments. They were refinements. The instinct that had carried him through fire after fire was no longer dragging him forward blindly. It was beginning to listen. For the first time in a long while, Danny wasn't reacting to chaos. He was walking alongside purpose, and that was new. What Danny could finally start to see internally wasn't a vision in the mystical sense. It was space, actual space, ground level, finished, settled. Not a tower rising anymore, not rooms being added, not emergency repairs or frantic restructuring, but a cleared floor, a place that belonged to him, a dragon space, something he hadn't stolen, borrowed, or defended, something he had built. And that's the part that startled him. Because dragons are used to motion, to pressure, to reaction. They're used to living in siege mode. But this was different. This was stillness with weight, presence without urgency, authority without threat, the kind of internal territory that doesn't need to prove it exists. He tried to explain it. Of course he did. That was the strange part. He could feel it, stand in it, operate from it. But if asked to map it, to define it, to draw a clean line around it, he couldn't. Not yet. Because this thing hadn't arrived all at once. It had been assembling itself quietly for years, during breakdowns, during chaos, during moments where the internal and the external blurred so badly he couldn't tell which one was driving. There were times it had taken over reality, times when metaphor became mechanism, when symbolism behaved like infrastructure, when the line between what was imagined and what was enacted stopped being a line at all. More importantly, this was something that no one could take from him. And now that Annie had lifted the fog on Omnist Hill, now that faith had been rekindled, not as delusion, but as orientation, Danny found himself doing something dangerous. He started saying it out loud, and hearing it back, and hearing it back again. And with each repetition, something unsettling crept in. Not fear, not doubt, awareness. He began questioning the system itself, the matrix, the scaffolding of reality. Not in a conspiratorial way, in a structural one. If this inner architecture could exist, if it could influence the external so consistently, then what exactly was the boundary between sanity and meaning, between belief and function, between destiny and pattern recognition? This is where Dragon Capricorn psychology matters. A double dragon doesn't hallucinate lightly. It constructs. It builds internally with the same seriousness it brings to the external world. Capricorn anchors that construction with discipline, time, and consequence. This wasn't fantasy spilling out of control. This was a mind that had spent years under siege finally stabilizing enough to notice what it had made. And that realization is destabilizing in its own right. Because once a dragon realizes it can build worlds internally, that work, the question isn't, am I insane? The question becomes, what the fuck is reality actually made of, if this is possible? And standing there in that finished space, Danny didn't yet have the answer. But he knew this much. Whatever he had built, whatever had finished assembling itself behind the noise, It was real enough to stand on, and real enough to change everything that came next. The only way Danny could ever explain it, when he tried at all, was to just call it a Danny space. Not a metaphor, not a fantasy realm, just a space that was his, a dragon space, something that had either been built piece by piece over years of pressure or had built itself while he was busy surviving. It contained the crucial things, the valuable things, the parts that couldn't be lost without everything collapsing. That was as close as he could get to language. Anything more detailed sounded mad, even to him. And maybe that was the point, because externally, things were finally calm. Not perfect, not blissful, but stable enough that autopilot could take over. Traveling, family rhythms, showing up, keeping promises, being present without having to constantly fight for oxygen. The people around him were the right ones, or at least not the wrong ones. On the surface, it looked like life had settled, and that's when the real work started. Because when a dragon finally stops fighting fires on the outside, the attention turns in whether he wants it to or not. And inside, Danny wasn't resting. He was figuring things out, sorting, noticing, connecting dots that had never had the luxury of lining up before. And here's the dangerous part. As Danny became aware, things became aware of him. Patterns sharpened, coincidences stacked. The sense of being observed, not by people, but by systems, crept back in. Not paranoia, recognition. The same feeling you get when you realize you've stepped into the middle of a mechanism that's been running long before you arrived. The Danny space wasn't just a refuge anymore. It was a signal. And while the external world hummed along on routine and stability, something beneath the surface had started to turn its head toward him. Not hostile, not friendly, just attentive. And Danny, whether he liked it or not, was now aware enough to notice it. This is where it drops out of psychology textbooks and into holy shit territory. Because what was happening wasn't breakdown, it wasn't delusion, it wasn't ego inflation, it was recognition. Danny had snapped quietly, cleanly, into something like civilian mode, as if after years of laying stone, hauling timber, fighting fires, arguing borders, he suddenly turned up at the gates of a fortress he'd never actually walked through. Not as the king, not as the architect, not as the child who grew up inside its walls, but as a visitor, and that changes everything. He walked it the way you walk somewhere ancient for the first time, slowly, reverently, half lost, half certain you've been here before, corridors that felt familiar without memory, rooms that carried weight without explanation, figures moving through the space who weren't strangers but weren't exactly known either. Deja vu stacked on deja vu. This was the ground-level mind fortress. Finished, operational, and Danny was no longer building it, he was observing it. That's the shift. First party Danny had been the son, living it, surviving it. Second party Danny had been the builder, designing systems under pressure, patching holes, reinforcing walls. But now there was a third party Danny, the witness, the one who could stand still and say, wait, this thing has been running without me. Clockwork, routine, courts convening, gardens growing, the crimson courtyard deliberating, the tower holding its structure. It didn't need him hovering anymore. And that's when alignment began. Pieces that had always been there but never visible from the inside started sliding into place on their own, not dramatically, elegantly, like a mechanism finally allowed to complete its cycle. And then that's when he noticed. No, not noticed, heard. Not a voice, not words, not an image, an echo, a resonance that didn't originate in the room, but responded to it. Like calling out into a canyon and realizing the reply isn't just sound, it's shape, distance, presence. The lunar ghost hadn't just been sitting there waiting. She'd been functioning, orbiting, reflecting, balancing the system quietly while Danny was too busy surviving to see her. And for the first time, not as longing, not as fantasy, not as projection, the third party Danny felt it. The echo wasn't imagination, it was compatibility. A frequency that answered his without effort, without forcing, without distortion. Romantic, yes, but not sentimental. Mystic, yes, but grounded. Magic not because it broke reality, but because it fit it. This wasn't a dream of a soulmate. This was the mind recognizing a missing harmonic. And standing there in that finished, humming, impossible fortress, Danny understood something that can't be taught and can't be rushed. You don't meet the echo while you're still building the walls. You hear it only when the structure is finally quiet enough to let the sound travel. And this is where it turns strange in the best possible way. Because when Danny isn't the son, and he isn't the builder, and he isn't the king performing for the outside world, when Danny is inside the mind fortress, the externals don't get a choice. They suffer whatever version of him is being activated by where he's standing. Not intentionally, not manipulatively, just mechanically. Danny is exploring. He's been aware of this place his whole life. As a child, he imagined it. As a young man, he watched it being assembled from the fence line, like a kid pacing behind you while you build something complicated from instructions, desperate to touch it but never invited in. Now he's inside, and it's overwhelming. When he steps into the library, the urge hits immediately. Study, read, consume, categorize, understand. His mind sharpens. He wants text, systems, frameworks, psychology, myth, history, patterns. The outside world feels him go quiet, distant, focused, eyes narrowing, words thinning, attention pulled inward. When he moves into the garden, something else takes over. Reflection, music, writing, relationship building. Grief loosening its grip just enough to turn into expression. Songs form, lines connect, compassion rises. People around him feel warmer, safer, more seen, even if they don't know why. Then there's the tavern. That place is dangerous. That's where the shrug-it-off Danny lives. The laughing, joking, borderline intolerable one. The arrogance, the bravado, the it'll be fine, fuck it energy. To some it's charming, to others unbearable. That's vitality without breaks, confidence without depth. And when he's there too long, people feel dismissed without ever being insulted. And then there are the battlefields. Walking there hurts like bare feet on broken glass. Memory opens, wounds reopen. The air is heavy, the dirt clings. This is where grief stops being poetic and becomes visceral. He walks among the ruins of old wars, relationships, betrayals, losses, versions of himself that died fighting for something that never existed. The outside world feels this one as tension. Silence, a sharpness in his voice, a weight that makes rooms feel smaller. He sees it all now, not as flashes, not as imagination, but as terrain. And the strangest part, these places already know him. It's like moving into a neighborhood where everyone's been watching your house get built for years. You finally step outside and there's this unspoken exchange. Nods, half smiles, recognition. They don't need introductions. He belongs here. He always has. And when Danny enters the war rooms where strategy, defense, and tactics sit, the outside feels it before he says a word. Situations get tense. Lines get drawn. The quake travels just far enough to be felt. That's when the mind fortress becomes something else entirely. Not just a structure, not just a metaphor, a place of refuge, a place Danny can retreat into while the world shakes itself apart outside. Somewhere ordered, meaningful, alive. Somewhere he can walk, observe, feel, and understand without having to explain himself to anyone. And for the first time in his life, he isn't running the place. He's living in it. He's just allowed to be. And while all of that was happening inside, while Danny was walking corridors, listening to echoes, finally understanding the machine he'd built, the outside world kept moving. Autopilot, mood to mood, agitation to agitation, days stitched together by routine rather than intention. That's how it always goes when something fundamental has already shifted, but the surface hasn't caught up yet. And it's right there that Emperor Andrew steps in, not with conquest, not with force, with absorption. Waywood doesn't fall, it doesn't fracture, it doesn't get taken, it gets folded in. The emperor assumes the mantle, not as a usurper, but as an emperor does, by taking weight off another ruler's shoulders and saying, I've got this now. The kingdom of Waywood joins the imperial union, and nationally, the burden Danny's been carrying, visibly or not, transfers, quietly, cleanly. This matters more than anyone realizes. Because for the first time since the woodland, Danny is no longer holding everything. The king remains on the surface, present, functional, holding the line. The crown doesn't vanish, it stabilizes. And when that happens, Danny's gaze finally lifts, not inward, not downward, outward, beyond crisis, beyond defense, beyond holding territory that was never meant to be permanent. His eyes start looking further afield, somewhere to settle, somewhere to build without being under siege, somewhere the queen can breathe. Somewhere the prince can grow without walls and watchtowers. Not another rebellion, not another proving ground. A home, integrated into the empire, not resisting it. taking what worked from Waywood, the hard lessons, the structures, the failures, and leaving behind what nearly broke them. And while this is happening, something else forms. Danny and Andrew, dragon, horse dragon, don't just shake hands and move on. They build. Not a treaty, a bridge, mutual respect, complementary instincts, one forged in chaos, the other built for endurance, power meeting patience, vision meeting logistics, more than alliance, architecture. And for the first time in a long while, Danny isn't reacting to the world. He's choosing where to stand next. And this is where the noise thins out and the real shapes start to appear. Not the loud ones, not the dramatic ones, the true ones. Friendships that don't need constant proximity to stay alive begin to reveal themselves. Ellen is still there, always has been. Not center stage, not drifting, just steady. Whales to the south coast put miles between them, but it doesn't matter. Their bond doesn't live in geography. It lives in messages, in timing. Snake and dragon understand distance. Sometimes closeness would only distort the signal. Scott comes back into orbit too. No crashing in, not making a show of it, just present again. Andrew shifts as well. Less emperor now, less weight in the room, more Waywoodian. An honorary one if such a thing exists. He's not looming over the kingdom anymore. He's sitting at the fire, visiting more often, grounded, human. That distinction is important. Power steps back when it's done its job. Autumn is still there too. Always has been. Not hovering, not demanding, just a cup of coffee away, close enough to reach without effort, far enough to let Danny breathe. Rat horse energy at its most functional, reliable without intrusion. Mandy the rooster remains in the background, still relevant, still ticking away. Even when she's not in the foreground, her part to play is still to come. John and Gemma had left after John's recovery. However, they still stay a constant in the background. Even if others had fallen away, the lifestyle isn't for everyone. The Ratton board discovered this pretty quickly. And then there's still Tommy, another dragon. But dragons don't flock, they orbit, they cross paths, they diverge. Tommy follows his own flight path now. Sometimes it aligns with Danny, sometimes it doesn't. No conflict in that, no betrayal. Just two dragons acknowledging that shared fire doesn't mean shared direction. That's maturity. And there, just behind the obvious lines of movement, Kat settles into the background, not pushing forward, not withdrawing, listening. She becomes a quiet, regular whisper in the dragon's ear, alongside Ellen. Two snake dragons, but now the distinction matters. Ellen is the elder snake, one generation older, sharper through experience, wiser through distance. A snake dragon who has already shed skins Danny hasn't yet outgrown. Kat is of Danny's generation, snake dragon Capricorn. Same era, same pressure, same karmic weather. A mirror not of who he was, but of who he is. And this is where the psychology locks in. The snake tethers them. The dragon allows resonance. Pure dragons don't orbit each other easily. They clash or diverge. Too much fire, too much sovereignty. They take their own flight paths and rarely look back. But snake-dragon hybrids are different. The snake binds. It remembers. It has loyalty over time instead of territory. That's why Ellen and Katrina can stay close without collision. They aren't competing dragons. They are substitute dragons, bound not by dominance, but by karmic loyalty. They can connect to Danny where other dragons cannot because they don't need to take his sky. They move within it. And then there's the little bird, still here, still there, exactly where she has always been. This is the part people miss if they try to read the story as sequence instead of structure. She doesn't move. She never has. She was present before the woodland, before the kingdom, before the mind fortress was under construction. She was there at the Big Bang, when pattern first became awareness, when humor and intelligence first learned how to coexist, when Danny didn't yet know what he was building, but was already building it. Her orbit was established before Danny understood gravity. It has never needed to be questioned. It has never needed to be justified. She is a presence that doesn't negotiate space. She defines it, constant, indirect, not pulling, not chasing. She remains, not because she waits, not because she demands, but because she was part of the system before the system became conscious of itself. And that's the difference between influence and inevitability. Danny doesn't always look up, but the tides still answer the moon. And then there were still others, not center stage, not gone either. People who remained constant in the background. still attempting to cross half-built bridges, still reaching out, still wandering the maze, still knocking at the gate, still waiting for a place in the tower, still waiting, consciously or not, for the dragon's judgment. That matters, because this was never a straight line. It's gravity, an orbit. People come, people go, people return, people drift. Some stay longer, some pass through once and are changed forever. Some hover for years, never quite landing, never quite leaving. Consistency isn't about closeness, it's about duration, time under gravity. And while all of this is happening, Danny isn't watching. Not because he's careless, because he doesn't have to be. The outside looks steady, functional, integrated. Empire secure, kingdom absorbed, family moving forward. That's when chaos does what it always does. It reinvents itself. Because chaos doesn't survive on noise, it survives on stillness. When the water's calm, it doesn't leave. It changes shape. And the snake dog is still here. That part can't be forgotten. She didn't arrive to build permanence. She didn't arrive to crown stability. She arrived for the same reason snake energy always arrives at a dragon's peak, to turn him to stone, so he can be shattered. So the pieces can be rebuilt properly, not under fire, not under siege, but under scrutiny, under the cold, unblinking eye of the snake dog. This was never about destruction for its own sake. It was about precision. And Danny, busy living, trusting the calm, believing the worst was behind him, doesn't see it coming. Not yet. But gravity is already shifting. And here's a necessary side note. The thing people always miss if they read this like gossip instead of structure: don't mistake a person for the pattern they're carrying. A person has opinions, history, bias, blind spots, agency. But when someone is spoken of as a snake, a dragon, a monkey, a horse, that isn't a judgment of character. It isn't blame, it isn't intention, it's function. Most of the time they have no idea what they're doing. Their movements aren't conscious strategy. They're instinctual, archetypal. They're responding to pressure, not plotting outcomes. And even when a movement looks intentional, it's usually because the pattern needs it to be. They're not villains, they're dominoes. And sometimes they're the hand nudging them. Sometimes they're the tile that gets knocked over. Sometimes they're both at once. Each domino falls into the next, quietly, predictably, until eventually they reach something different, something dense, something forged, something that doesn't fall easily. They reach Danny, stone hard, dragon cord, built from collapse and reconstruction. And the system doesn't know whether he'll shatter this time or whether he'll stand. One of the biggest dominoes in that chain is the wrecking ball that is the snake dog. But the person is living her life, loving, choosing, surviving, acting from her own wounds, hopes, instincts. But the snake she carries is doing something else entirely. Unknowingly, it's been clearing a path in front of her, lining up moments, creating missteps, setting timing, not out of malice, out of necessity, leading her to the dragon. It's not poetic. It's not romantic. It's karmic. Danny and Lai are different forces altogether. Snake and dragon are yin and yang, opposites. Dragon and dog are also opposites across the zodiac wheel. She didn't know it. He didn't know it. But her path crossed his at the right time. So the dragon trips when he needs to, falls when he needs to, hits the ground hard enough to finally see what's being built. Neither of them understands this while it's happening. That's the point. They don't see the snake, dog, and dragon at work. They only feel the friction, the confusion, the exhaustion, the sense of, why does this keep happening? And eventually, inevitably, the pattern completes its cycle. They break again, not because either of them failed, not because either of them was wrong, but because the structure demanded it. And it's right there at that fracture point that the story stops looping and starts closing. And this is where it has to be said plainly, without romance or blame. As people, they just could not exist in the same space anymore. Not safely, not sustainably, not without tearing something open every time they tried. That doesn't make either of them wrong. It doesn't mean they failed. It doesn't mean effort was lacking. It was function. Because chaos does not happen unless the forces designed to create it are present. And by this point, chaos still had work left to do. The snake dog had already pushed the dragon as far as she could by this point. The ground had been cracked, the stone exposed. But the final fracture, the one that actually teaches, required a different configuration. And this is where the pattern sharpens, Because it was never just about snakes and dragons. The dog is the hinge. Chaos cannot complete its lesson unless the dog is present. That's why Vicky mattered. That's why Annie mattered. That's why Lai mattered. Vicky was a dog rabbit. She taught loyalty first, nurture first, protection without possession. The rabbit builds the burrow, the dog guards the entrance. She represented safety, continuity, domestic grounding. Even when she stepped back, it wasn't weakness. It was self-respect. The dog does not beg to be chosen. It steps aside when the pack fractures. Annie was a sheepdog for a reason. She taught without dominance. She guarded without possession. She showed Danny how to stand without a crown, without needing to be admired. That dog energy wasn't gentle. It was corrective. Lee is a snake dog for a reason. The snake creates pressure, upheaval, the drop kick into transformation. But the dog enforces consequence. It stays, it judges, it draws lines and refuses to move them. A dragon cannot learn if the teacher is too favorable. Dragons don't grow under indulgence. They grow under boundary. There were the two snake dragons, of course, Ellen and Kat. They were never there to create chaos, never there to instigate it, never there to light the fuse. Their role was more precise than that. They were the binoculars, the magnifying glass, the telescope. Snake intuition, dragon language. They didn't push Danny into chaos. They helped him see it, name it, track it, navigate it. They could read the pressure in the air before it broke, feel the shift before it landed. Where other dragons had their own flight paths, Ellen and Kat could mirror Danny's. Not to lead him, not to rule him, but to translate what he was already moving through. That's what Snake Dragon does best. It doesn't command the storm. It explains the weather. So when Danny and Lee reached the point where they could no longer coexist without destruction, it wasn't failure. It was escalation. The snake had already exposed the stone. Now the dog had to hold him there long enough for the lesson to imprint. But her snake dog management was never going to hold a dragon long. Dragons see control coming. It's instinct. They fear it, so they remain vigilant. A snake dog can't compete with the intuition and instincts of a pure dragon sign. And without that snake dog, there is now no snake or dog to push the dragon forward. And that's when the snake monkey comes back into frame, not crashing in, not announcing herself. She arrives the way Snake Monkey always does, sideways, light-footed, smiling, curious, disarming, seductive, not to ruin, but to realization, to movement, to the next unavoidable truth. At the same time, Tommy steps forward, dragon dog, and suddenly the configuration is complete. Still dog in the mix. Loyalty, boundary, consequence, but now fused with dragon. A dragon dog doesn't seduce, it doesn't provoke, it holds. It stands in the doorway and says no. You don't get to run from this one. The snake monkey draws the dragon toward the lesson, not with manipulation, not with force, but with possibility, with ease, with the illusion of normality. The dragon dog closes the door behind him. No escape routes, no loopholes, no retreat into old skins. This time the lesson isn't going to get postponed. And just to be certain, Danny's old friend Jen is called into play. Not for the first time either. She orbits Danny and comes into his life at seemingly random times, this being one of them, because to move a force like Danny, you need a fucking army, and Jen was the reinforcement. Monkey horse, and that matters. More monkey energy in the mix, an energy that dragons simply can't resist. To a dragon, monkey energy is pure gravitational pull. But she's also a horse, and that's forward motion at high speed with a monkey at the reins. And when Tommy met Jen, they got together. And for a brief moment, just a moment, it all looks like it's working. The dragon, the dragon dog, the snake monkey, the monkey horse, just conversation. Dinners, connection, laughter, nights out. That quiet sense of something clicking into place without effort. The kind of calm that feels earned. The kind of calm that feels like the pattern might finally let him rest. When the outside world goes calm, and when Danny's inner world finally settles, balance demands a counterweight. Chaos doesn't disappear, it relocates. Up until now, most lessons had come through people, through mirrors made of flesh and opinion and choice, pushing, holding, reflecting, resisting. While the dragon was learning from dragons, while the snake was learning from snakes, while the dog was enforcing consequence and boundary, the universe was watching. And when no person can be blamed, avoided, negotiated with, or misunderstood, the universe steps in directly. No symbolism, No disguise, no metaphor softened by choice. A final volcanic push. The kind that doesn't teach through chaos, but through irreversibility. Because some lessons cannot be learned from mirrors. Some cannot be learned from lovers, friends, enemies, or archetypes. Some lessons only arrive when the ground itself gives way. And this time, it wasn't a snake. It wasn't a dragon. It wasn't a dog. It was the universe itself closing the circle and pushing Danny the rest of the way forward by taking away his mom.